I'll start recording now, and I'll hand it over to Eddie. If anyone's got any questions, of course, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So really encourage questions from people. So yeah, I'll hand over to Eddie.
Yeah, no worries. No, thanks. Good to be here. Hopefully, I can add to some of the very interesting stuff that we've already been listening to. But yeah, this is about looking at studying the sporting and cultural transitions from Gaelic games to the AFL. I suppose I studied this as part of my masters. And I suppose uh, I'm probably not that many people here probably know much about Gaelic football, or maybe Australian football for that matter either. But I suppose I would encourage you as we're going through this, I suppose to think about, how the different transitions could apply, in the sports that you're working in potentially, even if it isn't necessarily Gaelic games or Aussie rules. But yeah, no, we'll jump into it because so it could be quite long. But yeah, I suppose in terms of the background, what we're looking to do is we're looking to investigate the popular switch of GA athletes that were moving to the Australian Football League. And I suppose just in terms of background around Gaelic games, it's an amateur sport in Ireland. It's a predominant sport in Ireland. But I suppose from around the 1980s, players were making the switch from GA to the AFL because of the similarities within the sport. If you aren't aware of either sport, both sports are, I suppose, field invasion sports. There's a lot of kicking of the ball, handling of the ball. You kick through goal posts. There's a lot of running. So, there is a lot of similarities there. I suppose the major difference being that one of the balls in the GA football is round, like soccer ball, for example, whereas in the AFL, the ball, as you would have seen in those pictures there, it's like a rugby ball. I suppose that's one of the major differences, and then obviously different rule changes and things like that. But the AFL has been quite interested because of the similarities in taking some of the GA lads and bringing them across and trying to transition them into AFL players just because of their background and their athleticism. Um, and so as a result, as part of your masters, I thought this would be quite an interesting one because around the time there had been, I suppose, quite a few high level or high profile or transfers that had taken place. Um, However, one of the things that has always been noted about it is some players can be really, really successful and have, really good careers, while some of them, just don't play any games at all. And I suppose that was what we were kind of interested in, was the idea, is it perhaps, a psychological um way of looking at this? And maybe that could be a way of helping to mediate that transition for those players, and helping those transitions become maybe more successful. So yeah, like I say, the little research carried out in this topic, and again, there's still quite a dearth of research into the area. But we looked at it and sort of considered, okay, it's going to be three sub transitions here. So the amateur to professional, the cultural, and the switch in sport. So we're just going to sort of touch on sort of the elements of those. So in terms of the amateur to professional transition overall in sport, it's, if you're playing any professional sport at all, you're going to have to go through this transition. And it's one of the most common and negatively reported transition in sport. Athletes struggle with this transition quite a bit. And Stan Belova talked about in their research that the transition can take between 1 and 4 years. And again, for us, when you're thinking that some of these athletes going out there are maybe 20, 21 already, well, if that transition takes 4 years, well, you're talking about a player who's maybe not able to, compete at the top of their game until they're about 24, 25. And, in professional sport, it's quite cutthroat. So again, could that be maybe an area to look at? But I suppose in the general literature, some of the major difficulties: lack of playing time, failure to meet personal expectations, lack of, you know, time in terms of, lack of balance, again, with the extra requirements a professional level, and then critical comments from coaches and peers. So these are some of the stressors that athletes meet, across the literature. Then in terms of cultural transition, so Qantas and Breland Noble spoke about the idea that immigrant athletes undergo a period of cultural adjustment following their migration, which can result in stress. And again, we think about that idea of stress impacting well-being, and again impacting performance there as well. And again, key area for us looking at, obviously Irish athletes moving to Australia. Cultural transitions there, I suppose, slightly more nuanced, in the sense that, there's no language barrier for the most part. But there's going to be still some sort of subtle differences there. And again, I suppose broader picture as well, it doesn't even have to be, movement of a country. Those cultural transitions are occurring, within countries, within small areas, as well. But again, difficulties for athletes at this stage, different training approaches between different cultures, different dynamics between coaches and players that you can experience due to culture, homesickness, loneliness, and gelling with new teammates. And again, so that's sort of the literature across a range of different sports tells us of the major issues for athletes at this stage. And then lastly, switching sport. Pretty much almost no research into this area. It's very limited. But of the limited research that there is, as you would expect, alternate skills is difficult at such a point in an athlete's career. And I suppose by that point, we're talking about when an athlete's moving into the mastery stage. So we're talking about these athletes moving to the AFL at 18, 19, 20. That is generally the time in most field invasion sports where athletes are starting to really settle down and really they went through the development stage and they're starting to master the sport that they're in, whereas these guys are going, okay, I'm going to go play a totally new sport, and that's difficult. And I suppose one of the few pieces of research into GA athletes moving to the AFL, they did find that, while a Gaelic background is useful, it's not a definitive aid. And I suppose that was something we already knew just by, looking at the evidence that the careers that have been had, that, just because fellows were playing Gaelic games, they weren't necessarily, being successful in making the switch to the AFL. But again, such limited research on that. But again, when we think about the wider world, switching sports is something that's becoming more popular. And again, you think about the globalization of sport, and I suppose the money in sport. We're seeing MMA fighters switching into boxing. Again, very similar sports, but also slightly different. Again, I think if we're looking at those rugby players switching to NFL, I think Reece Samet, the Welsh rugby player, he's switched to the NFL. He's been signed by Kansas. So I think that area of switching sports is something that's becoming a lot more popular, and people just have more options now. So again, it's probably an area that might start to grow, I suppose, in terms of the research as well. And so what we done was we were sort of interested in looking at the transition through those three sub-transitions. And then we used Wyman and Lavell's model of normative transitions. And, I talked about that mastery stage there earlier, where players were making that switch. And you can see at this athletic level, athletic stage of development, these guys are making that switch, 18, 19, 20. And that's when you should be going into that mastery stage of development and really honing your craft. But these guys are now really switching back into the initiation stage. So again, you can see, where there could be difficulties within that. And also, interestingly, particularly as we'll come to see around the psychosocial level, the athletes that we're talking about, they're going through a huge psychosocial level. They're getting support around this stage from their peers, their coach, and their parents, and those are important to them at those stages. However, moving to a new country, that psychosocial support is altered. greatly. And again, you still have that, I suppose, that psychological level, sort of that switch from adolescent to young adulthood, around 16, 17, 18. So again, not long into that. So again, what we're kind of interested in was seeing how these different dynamics also interacted with each other using this model. So I suppose in terms of the main aims and sort of, I suppose, recapping that, we're looking to see why some players were successful in making the transition and why others were not. And the main research questions that we were going in with: what's the experience of going from an amateur to a professional footballer like? What is it like to move to a new country to pursue this career? What were the difficulties of learning a new sport so late in the development, according to Wyman and Lavell's developmental model? And then how did you feel to cope? And how did you cope and how did you feel to deal with the above? So I suppose that's kind of the background as to what we were looking at. Again, I suppose we'll not get too bogged down the method, but we had 6 participants, 4 that had went out and were back in Ireland, and they had finished their contracts, and then 2 that were active players. And I suppose we took the phenomenological approach. So semi-structured interviews, one-to-ones, FaceTime phone calls, and what we were doing was we just wanted to hear the athlete's experience, what they were telling us, and then we were interpreting that and trying to see if we could sort of find some common themes that were coming across within that data. So in terms of the results and what we found, I suppose we found 3 main themes, and within them there were various different sub-themes. Okay, so I suppose first off we had motivating factors, within that internal pressure, luring factors, and then we had stressors, and then the adapting factors. So what were the challenges, and then how were they able to cope with them? And we'll take a look at each of them in a little bit more depth here now. So I suppose internal pressure was quite a common theme in terms of what motivated them to go out there, and what I suppose pushed them to engage in the transition. And again, I suppose it's something we have to keep in mind that these guys are elite athletes in their own right already. So they're always going to have that sort of internal pressure. And again, it's something that I suppose for the most part, it wasn't debilitating for them. But again, I suppose it's something that must be monitored. And again, you see there the links that it can lead to perfectionism. And again, especially when we're in the process of switching sport, that's something that we really want to avoid, is that perfectionism, because there's going to be so many mistakes that these guys were going to be experiencing. But again, a major theme within that. And then obviously the other motivating factors was this idea of learning factors in a sense. And it was interesting. Money was one that come up, but it was only for the players who were actually still currently playing. So the players that had come back, they didn't really reference money. And again, I wonder, we sort of were thinking that was perhaps because they were living in the situation at that time that okay, well, we're getting paid, so it's almost like a dream. And some of the things that they were saying, like the reason that they come over, Gaelic players come over, is to play. But the big thing was the professional lifestyle. In terms of Gaelic games, it's amateur. There's no professional, no professional status with it, no matter what level you are. So if you're growing up playing, Gaelic football, you're never really going to be a professional sports person in that field. So the draw of the professional lifestyle was massive. And again, I suppose that sort of question mark then of, okay, is are these lads thinking about the wider picture potentially? Because again, at 18, 19, 20 years of age, if they're just being lured, I can be a professional athlete, are they thinking about the wider factors around that as well? But again, I suppose some of the key motivating factors there. And then when we start to take a look at the stressors, so major one, obviously, come through the increased intensity and quantity of training. And I think this is maybe something that caught some of the players out slightly, because again, within Gaelic games, it's professional, but these lads are training to quite a high level. So, some would say it's almost like at a semi-professional level. But the big thing that came through was these lads were saying that it's, it's night and day, the difference in terms of that intensity and obviously the quantity of training. And again, that coincided with the switching of sports and the feeling that, you had to catch up as well. So, they were already being met with, oh, we have to train a lot more here. And now I have to train a lot more on top of what I'm already doing because I'm playing catch up. Because as Abernathy and Barry talked about, the expert AFL players have 2,500 hours prior to the age of 18 that they're coming into the league with. Whereas these guys have about 30 hours. So again, that was, I suppose, quite a big stressor. And again, sort of those days off that they would be expected to have, or that they'd be looking forward to, they would have been spending in the club doing extra work, just trying to catch up, just striving to get to that level. Obviously, a big one is going to be missing family. And again, maybe something that, when we think about the motivating factors, that idea of professional lifestyle, maybe the missing family was something that, while it was taken into account prior to, maybe didn't realize how big an impact it was going to be. But again, you can see where Wyman and Lavell's model comes in and kind of highlights that, this is already a big a major stage that they're going through here. And then when we throw this in on top, it can have a major negative impact. And again, lots of talk around homesickness. And again, like I say, a lot of these lads, they're still living at home when they're out there. Some of them are just like have literally left school at 18, and they struggle big time with the missing family piece. Again, obviously big one, sort of links in closely with the other element of the extra training, but obviously new sport, adapting to the skills and rules. Again, they talk about the different tackling. There's more rules. And one of the lads actually, who was still a current player, said, "I still don't even know half the rules, that are in the game." Which again, I suppose highlights that difficulty adapting, and I suppose the more structured element to the game in terms of different patterns. But again, lads spending a lot of time in terms of I suppose getting caught up. Maybe they're missing the time to learn the rules as well and things like that. And that tied in with the idea of mistakes. A lot of players talk about mistakes, obviously technical mistakes, but also rules of the mistakes. And one of the big ones was within those mistakes, there was the differences in the sense of perceived criticism of mistakes, because particularly in the media, there would have been the question mark as to why you bring in, why are Irish players coming over? Why you bringing, these players over? There's plenty of players in Australia. So if an Irish player was to make a mistake, and it was quite a high profile one several years ago, where it was you know magnified quite a lot in the media. And I suppose I suppose people who are experienced in AFL rules, it was quite a basic mistake. It was maybe they would have seen it as quite an obvious one. But again, when we're taking into account all these different stressors, trying to learn the rules of the game, these mistakes can happen. But then obviously the differences within that criticism and the time to make these mistakes is really in the developmental stage. But these lads are expected to, I suppose, nearly be in that mastery stage and nearly skip that. So again, that was one of the big things that come through within that. Now, in terms of obviously the coping mechanisms, I suppose for us, these are the kind of things that really helped and wanting to, I suppose, encourage clubs to consider. Big one, obviously, Irish support network. So again, there's already some Irish lads out there, and some of the lads would actually have transferred to those clubs, and that helped them quite a lot within that. I think you see that more now with some of the more recent transfers that are happening. Players are going to clubs where there are already Irish lads at. Again, just to have that support network. And again, some of the lads that were slightly older that had went out, they already knew a few people out there already, which again was a major happening. And again, if you're in Ireland at the minute, I don't know if there's anybody still left. They're all the way to Australia, so I think that one will be that support network out there will just be even wider. I suppose contrary to the research that had previously suggested, in a way that the GA background, isn't, it's not going to be a definitive factor in terms of, meaning that you're going to make it as such. The players did feel that having a GA background did help. Part of that was they were maybe seeing players come from basketball and rugby and feeling that they were struggling more than them. So they thought that was more beneficial than any other background. But again, obviously, I suppose the fact that it's an invasion sport and with the kicking and catching, those attributes did help. So they did feel that the GA background did help in that regard. And I suppose this was probably one of the quite interesting ones, and one that we've probably seen a change in is the age difference of so some of the lads go out at 18, some of them maybe go a little bit older, obviously 19, 20, 21, so on. But 18, a lot of the lads said it was probably too young. They found the lads that went out at 18, found it really difficult. One of them didn't even play any games. They went back after a few months. Whereas the experience with the older lads, they kind of talk about having a little bit more life experience. And they found that had helped them, even though it was only a couple more years. But again, they found that was a little bit more beneficial. And we kind of see that in the wider world with the NBA, where they, I suppose, I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, they changed their drafting process so that you had to do at least a year of college. So it was changing from 18 to 19. But one of the, I suppose, caveats to this age piece was the older that you are when you go out, but the harder it is to learn the game. So it's sort of that catch-22 of how can we get the lads out young, and that they can start to develop quickly, but that they aren't, having the psychosocial struggles. Whereas if we're coming out older, maybe they can adapt to the other transition elements easier, but is it going to be harder for them to learn the skills? But I think in more recent times, you have seen the likes of maybe Oisin Mullen, who's 22 when he went out. Charlie Gallagher from Monaghan's 21, so I think they are starting to take him out a little bit older now. So and then accommodation again, probably not one that you would have, I suppose I would have expected, to be such a vital part of it, but something that came across as so important was the idea of, being put in with, other players and, having great stability in accommodation in that early stage, because a couple of players referenced how their accommodation bounced about early on, and they changed accommodation early on quite regularly. When they first came over, and that really put them out of sync. Whereas the lads that I suppose tended to have more serviceable careers, anything over 20 games, their initial accommodation was quite structured and quite secure. So again, something to something that I suppose we found, I suppose, really interesting, and that I suppose didn't think was going to play such a massive part in it. And the accommodation for some people, it was just being with, some of them were put with like an Australian family, but they just found that really beneficial as well. Was again that structure to it. So, and then the last thing, the mental toughness piece. So we sort of categorized it here as mental toughness, and this was something that came through in those players that played over 20 first team games. And I suppose two kind of key terms kind of come up, with this idea of stubborn and just the competitiveness. And I suppose it's just what they, just sort of nearly stuck it out in a way. And one of the lads just like, I want to play a game. I said, I'm going to play one game before I go home. And they ended up having a really good career. And I suppose other ideas, just that competitiveness. And again, I suppose mental toughness being a real buffer against those stressors like mistakes and the extra training and things like that. Was found to be, I suppose, massive internal psychological component. So I suppose in terms of major considerations as coaches, really to take away, I suppose one of the big things was sort of that internal pressure that athletes can put on themselves in terms of making the transitions and the motivations for that. Again, it can be really helpful in some ways in terms of pushing them towards that transition, but is there times when it maybe becomes unhelpful in terms of putting pressure on themselves? And again, we looked at all those those things like the stressors in terms of the mistakes, for example, and learning the new rules, does that amplify that pressure that they experience? And then obviously, the importance of that psychosocial support, particularly when players are moving from, into different cultures. And again, the impact that the age has within that psychosocial support, and within those mechanisms, and also at the psychological level, how they're able to handle, that major transition there. But also within that age piece, there's that idea of, if we're looking at players who are switching sports, how can we navigate the idea of getting them over at just the right age, where they're in a good position to learn new skills, but that it doesn't impact them negatively in terms of the psychological elements, or in the psychosocial level. So again, it's trying to find that balance as well. And then I suppose when we were doing this, kind of the thought was like, where do we go now with research? I suppose it hasn't really been anything that's looked into this any further, which I thought was quite strange, but it was something for myself to look down. But again, what is the right age? What's the best age for that transition to happen? And also the other element was the impact of the opposite transition. So players that leave Australia and go back to Ireland, what's that transition like for them? And I suppose the last one, and more recent years, the women's AFL started in 2017. That's really kicked off. And the interesting thing is, from the outside looking in, there's a lot more Irish women competing in it than there is Irish men competing in the men's game, and they seem to be a lot more successful in terms of winning best player, and things like that. So again, maybe what's the differences that's happening there as well. But yeah, I suppose that's just a summary of the research that we did. So I suppose if anybody has any questions, more than happy to take them. Oh,
Eddy, thanks so much for that. That was really, really interesting talk, and I think probably quite a new area to some people as well. I'm just really wary of time, so we've got the lunch break straight after this. So, because I know there's a couple of really good questions in the chat there, but maybe you can just speak to Eddy during the lunch break, and ask those questions, because yeah, just wary of time there. But thank you very much for that, Eddy. That was
no
great.
worries.
So if you could just stop sharing your screen, there we go. And our next talk will be from Matt McKeen. So Matt, are you happy to share your slides?
Yes, yeah. Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'll try doing that now.
Yeah, like I was saying before, I'm sure there's definitely time for questions for Eddy, but I think we'll just get Matt's talk done, and then we can spill over into lunch.
Is that all right? Can you see? Can you see a black screen?
I can see a blank screen, yes.
Yeah, okay, I'll come up now, don't worry. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Eddy. Thank you to everyone that's attending today, and everyone that's kind of been involved in organising today's event. So yeah, my name is Matt McKeen, and I'm a trainee sports psychologist. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, we will look at how to enhance your goal setting beyond just using SMART goals. So I'll probably talk for about 15 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be 5 minutes at the end for questions. But then, as Adam's already said, we've got a lunch break straight after. So before we go into that, I thought I'd just give you a quick summary of my background. As I said, I'm a trainee sports psychologist, currently enrolled on the British Psychological Society's QSEP pathway. A brief history of my education is presented on the slide for you. Once completed, my current qualification will give me chartered psychologist status with the BPS, as well as a practitioner psychologist status with the HCPC. I am also the founder of Flourish and Thrive, which is a sport and performance psychology consultancy that works with individuals, teams, and organizations from the worlds of sport, business, and the military to help them develop the necessary mental tools, strategies, and skills to optimize their health and performance as performers, and importantly, as people. I'll leave my contact details at the end of the presentation should you wish to get in touch. Today's presentation has four broad aims to highlight the benefits of goal setting, to challenge the idea that every goal we set should be smart, to explain how goal setting works, and to share 3 recommendations for enhancing your goal setting. As I said, I also hope to have some time at the end for your questions, but should we overrun, just message me directly. It's all right. Goal setting is one of the most common mental tools used by sports coaches and sports psychology practitioners like me, and it has strong links with motivation, participation, and also performance. However, if not used appropriately, the goals we set ourselves can actually harm these 3 things. By way of an example, I'll share a brief story about a friend of mine who ran the London Marathon just last month. A few days before the marathon, my friend admitted to me that he was starting to feel some anxiety, some tension around the goal that he'd set himself, which was to complete the 26.2 miles in under 4 hours. So this is an objective thousands of runners set themselves every year. It's a goal that I've set myself too, as well in the past, and one I'm still yet to realize, but that's a story for another day. As race day approached, my friend's competitive nature, for want of a better word, was taking over after his girlfriend had completed the Paris Marathon just 2 weeks before in 4 hours, 6 minutes. He started to wonder, could he beat her time? Could he sneak round in sub 4 hours? Should he try to, knowing that it would hurt more and probably it might sabotage his chances of completing the marathon altogether? So when we met for the coffee the week before the race, he shared some of these thoughts with me. And in the remainder of this presentation, I'll share with you what I shared with him then. One way in which we are often encouraged to set goals is by using the SMART acronym, which is a goal setting technique that was first proposed by an American business consultant named George T. Duran more than 40 years ago. So I'm sure you're already familiar with what it stands for, but just in case you're not, it said that to be as effective as possible, our goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Since they were first introduced by Duran, SMART goals have grown in popularity more than I think he'd ever have imagined. They're currently recommended by organizations all over the world, including both the NHS and the American College of Sports Medicine. So returning to my marathon example, my friend's marathon, my friend had set himself a SMART goal to run 26.2 miles in less than 4 hours. On the surface, this goal ticks all the right boxes. It's specific, it's measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. But as I've already told you, this goal was causing him some anxiety. So my question is, are SMART goals really as clever as we've been led to believe? A recent academic review looking at the scientific evidence supporting SMART goals suggests that perhaps they're not. So 7 of their findings are presented on the slide. In the interest of time, we will just look at 3 in this presentation, but I refer you to the original paper should you like to discover more. So Swan and colleagues highlighted that the SMART acronym is inconsistently applied. So in the 147 studies reviewed by the researchers, 34 different terms were used to define the SMART acronym. In fact, the most widely used criteria, often associated with SMART goals, which is what I've presented on the slide, actually conflicts with Duran's original wording. For Duran, the A referred to assignable, not achievable. And some practitioners also specify that a goal must use all 5 criteria, which again conflicts with Duran's interpretation. Duran originally said that a goal didn't have to use all 5, it could just use 1 or 2. So what I'm trying to say is that there is no single agreed approach to using SMART goals. And in many cases, it is not being applied as it was originally intended. The second finding that Swan and colleagues shared was that the SMART acronym conflicts with goal setting theory. So goal setting theory is based on over 1,000 empirical studies across a broad range of tasks and contexts, and it underpins the majority of goal-setting interventions. Goal-setting theory argues that challenging or difficult goals result in greater performance than easy goals. But as you can see on the slide, SMART goals recommend goals be both achievable and realistic. Additionally, recent research suggests that goals do not need to be specific to be effective, but more on that later. Third and finally for now, there is repetition in the SMART criteria. Measurable goals are already specific, and realistic goals are by definition achievable. So now that we've discovered that SMART goals aren't quite everything that we've been led to believe, let's take a step back for a moment and consider what a goal actually is and how goals are proposed to work. A goal is being defined as the object or aim of an action, such as to attain a specific standard of proficiency, usually within a specified time. As I mentioned earlier, goal-setting theory is a theory of motivation that seeks to explain the fundamental causes of why some of us perform better at tasks than others. According to this theory, the practice of setting goals is proposed to enhance our performance via these four mechanisms presented on the slide. Just give you a moment to read those. So my question now is, if not SMART goals, then what? In the remainder of this presentation, I will share with you 3 recommendations for enhancing your goal setting practice. First recommendation is focus on the process. In a sport context, goals are typically classified according to one of 3 main categories: outcome, performance, and process. Outcome goals focus on achieving specific results, like winning the next golf competition at your local club or getting a promotion at work. Whilst these goals can provide direction to our behaviours, they are also heavily reliant on a number of external factors beyond our control, such as the performance of other competitors or our colleagues at work. Consequently, outcome goals can be sources of stress and anxiety. In contrast, performance goals focus on improving relative to our past performances. They should be set in such a way that aligns with our desired outcome. So, thinking of golf and thinking of promotion at work, we could reduce our golf handicap or we could increase our sales. The main advantage with performance goals is their controllability. Performance goals are self-referenced, so normative and social comparisons aren't made. However, unlike process goals, which I'll describe in a moment, performance goals fail to address how to achieve performance improvement. Process goals focus on improving specific techniques or strategies that you will engage in during the performance. For example, improving our swing technique at the golf course, or trying to build a more personal relationship with colleagues and customers at work. So process goals are the foundation upon which successful completion of our performance and outcome goals depend. That's why they're at the bottom of the pyramid. So it will become as no surprise that a recent review of goal setting in sport revealed that process goals improve numerous psychological outcomes, such as self-efficacy, intrinsic motivation, and satisfaction, and had the largest effect on performance. It seems that there might be some truth in the expression focus on the process and the result will take care of itself. My second recommendation is focus on you. Self-reference goals, by which I mean those where we focus on ourselves, not anyone else, tend to facilitate better performance and health outcomes over the long term than goals where we compare ourselves to others or perceive social norms. So within the goal setting literature, this is typically referred to as setting a mastery or task goal rather than a performance or ego goal. We also know that where we seek to improve, or goals where we seek to improve, are typically more beneficial than goals where we seek to not be worse than a previous performance. So this is known as adopting an approach goal rather than avoidance. In other words, when setting goals, we should aim to approach success and improvement rather than to avoid failure. Together, these two findings suggest that we should set what are called mastery approach goals, where we focus on developing competence, mastering new skills, and improving personal performance. These goals are oriented towards self-improvement and growth rather than external validation, comparison, or competition. And finally, my third recommendation is to match goal specificity to skill level. So as I mentioned earlier, goal setting theory claims that specific challenging goals result in higher task performance than easy vague goals. However, a deeper look at the evidence base tells that trying for specific challenging goals may actually hurt performance in certain circumstances, such as in the early stages of learning a new complex task. As a result, researchers suggest that goal setting or goal specificity, should be matched with our current capability. If we have already had some experience at a particular task, specific goals might work well for us. However, if we're a complete novice, then non-specific goals are likely to be better suited to our current skill level. This is one of the elements that I think was affecting my friend before his marathon. So what do we mean by non-specific goals? Well, non-specific goals come in all shapes and sizes, but they are typically defined as having some degree of ambiguity in the exact level of performance required. Rather than the endpoint, they are normally judged against the point at which we start. There are probably three main types of non-specific goals, and each of them have their own little nuances. So we have open goals, do your best goals, and as well as possible goals. To understand the effectiveness of each non-specific goal type, a recent study sought to compare these three forms with SMART goals. Open goals, which are completely open-ended and were first reported by professional golfers who said things like, "I just want to see how big a lead I can build," when describing exceptional performances, were found to be the most beneficial form of non-specific goal. It's been suggested that open goals lead to optimal individualized levels of challenge and difficulty. A couple of examples are presented on the slide for you. So in summary, it is not my intention to scare you off goal setting, nor do I wish to say that SMART goals are completely ineffective. As I said right at the start of the presentation, goal setting is one of the most popular mental tools and can result in significant performance gains when used correctly. However, I do hope that this presentation has highlighted that using a simplistic one-size-fits-all tool like SMART goals can fail to capture much of the nuance and complexity that is involved when setting and working towards a goal. I hope in the last 15 minutes or so, we've gone some way to addressing that. To summarize, I'll leave you with 3 recommendations to improve your goal setting. Returning to my friend's marathon attempt, I would argue that a goal of completing the distance in less than 4 hours and beating his girlfriend or girlfriend's time are both examples of outcome goals and ego goals. By taking the time out of the equation and reminding himself why he signed up in the first place, my friend was able to focus on the process and set himself a new mastery goal, which was to do the best that he could and to have fun whilst doing it. As a trainee sports psychologist at Flourish and Thrive, I can help you enhance your goal setting practice and ensure that you set the right goals for your needs. So please don't hesitate to reach out and get in touch if you'd like to chat more about this. For the recording, there's my references, and I'll leave my contact information on the next slide. So if you scan the QR code on the left with your phone, it will come up You can automatically save my email, my LinkedIn, and my Instagram page to your phone. And if you have any feedback, there's a short feedback form. I think there's just 5 questions, and I can answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for that, then, Matt. That was really interesting. So, different take on SMART goals that we've perhaps seen before. So, Irina just had a question there in the chat. So, just a couple of questions before we kind of break for lunch, guys. But so you mentioned open goals, do your best goals, and then what was that third set of goals you also mentioned, Matt?
It was as well as possible goals.
As well as possible goals. Do you mind just giving us an example of one of those, then, Matt?
Yeah, well, so they are kind of, there's very little differences between them. I think there's a paper, I think it was recently published. I'm not sure if it's in the reference list. Just check. No, but I think Williamson, so he's at the end. Williamson recently talked about this. So I think it might have been a different paper. But yes, so as well as possible goals, they are, yeah, doing the best that you can do. Do your best goals, you're tying it to kind of like a previous best performance. So there's still a little bit more specificity to that than an as well as possible goal. But yeah, the paper, I think it was by Williamson, definitely delves into it a little bit more. But the main finding from that study was the open goals were actually the most beneficial.
Excellent. Thanks for that, then, Matt. Yeah, I've been doing some research as well at the moment, trying to apply open and do your best goals with people with heart failure. So it's interesting to see how this might apply in sport and kind of non-sporting kind of situations as well. So I'll have to chat to you about that at some point. And right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for Eddie and Matt's talks. They were excellent. So I'll stop the recording now.